Oh, well, we'll have to see on that one if I actually get some time to work on my personal project. Maybe they'll ship simultaneously, who knows? Oh, quite difficult, I would say. This is actually with Paradox, my first time being on a project that isn't announced yet. Because when I joined EU4, and that wasn't out yet, but it was announced. And when I joined Stellaris, Stellaris was also announced. So it's been I mean, of course, I've been on expansions that haven't been announced before. So it's not like I've been completely unfamiliar to being in the dark, but it's definitely the first time I've been in this kind of radio silence for several years, and I am very much looking forward to breaking it. No, I absolutely think it's real. I mean, of course, there is the memes about it, and there is like, and I think in a sense the meme might be larger than the hype, but I don't think it's just a meme. I think it is very much that the Victoria series is kind of unique in its complete focus on society building. It's the emphasis of war, it's heavy emphasis on industry and politics and the era and everything going on. And I think ultimately, the hype and the meme stems from a longing for this niche to be filled with another game, that isn't 10 years. It's 11 now years old that hasn't been updated for 8 years. And I think that's the real wellspring of it. And I think that goes beyond just the core community, that there isn't anything quite like the Victoria games. I mean, that's a big reason I was very excited to work on the game, because I am a Victoria fan and there isn't anything quite like the Victoria games. I wanted to play this, so I wanted to make it.
Great. Yeah, I don't think that I'm not a memologist, but I don't think that it would have survived as long as it did if it's not for the fact that there's still like a core player base that plays Victoria 2. We see very high player numbers for this game, especially considering its age, right? And I just saw like a couple of days ago a pretty cool map mod that came out for it and things like that. So there's still lots of people really enthusiastic about this series.
But I do also think it extends to people who would like to get into Victoria, but who find it difficult to get into a game that's so old. So that's another part of it, I think. So it's been in development. Like, I was part of very early concepting back in 2016. And then was in pre-production for like early development for quite a while. So Mikael, you actually besides the look like early and like designing the core of the game, you were part of the project in terms of production before I was in 2017, and I hopped on the project in 2018, a bit before leaving Stellaris. So quite a while. I mean, we wanted to really take our time with this one. It's a big thing. And, we want to get it right. We want to make sure that we're delivering, sort of the Victoria game that people want and deserve. I mean, ultimately, the way a project starts is essentially there is someone, a game director or someone who can be able to step up to be game director, who is the champion of this, who makes the pitch, who comes with the design, and who wants to be the torchbearer for this. And then it's a matter of, making the pitch, writing up the vision. This is how I want to make it, and then getting it greenlit, getting a team, getting things up and running, doing prototyping. So it's quite a process, but ultimately the way this game happened is really no different from how any of our other projects start, despite its, difference in terms of how it's perceived by the community. Despite what the community says, where it's like it'll never be made. I think there was always this sense that we absolutely wanted to make Wiki 3, and it was just a matter of when, and like when do we have the right design for it, when do we have the right people for it, and yeah, that's essentially it's always all down to timing and how things worked out. But at least as long as I've been at the company, which is before the last Victoria 2 expansion release, there has never been the sense that we don't want to do Wiki 3. It's always been the sense that we want to do Wiki 3, but we have to get it right.
So the key elements, economy and politics are, of course, the two main pillars, right? Diplomacy comes in as a close third, I would say. But that is the core loop and the core conceit of Victoria is that you improve your economy and that changes your country. And now your people have different political ideas and different political balance of power inside your country, which might necessitate change. And this engine that you're building up with economy and politics can then be leveraged or needs to be leveraged on the diplomatic scene in order to protect your borders and potentially to enforce your diplomatic aspirations in the world.
So, bit of a difficult question to answer because, like, we haven't, while early prototyping started a bit with the Victoria 2 code base, everything in terms of like the code is new, but of course there's a lot of inspiration and, you know, a lot of things kept in terms of, you know, we have the Victoria pops, we have goods, we have a lot of these things that are very familiar, but they might also work in a sort of subtly different way, but fulfilling the same purpose. So percentage, really hard to say. Do you want to take a stab at this one, Mikael?
32.7. No. No, but yeah, everything, of course, we want to make sure that we don't alienate the Victoria fan base, right? So, of course, we're going to make sure that everything that was in Victoria 2 that was beloved exists in some facet in Victoria 3. But we've gone over everything with like a fine comb, both in terms of design and code, to make sure that everything is like re-envisioned, to make sure that it fits with the new things that we're introducing, that none of the mechanics sort of fight each other. So we've had to do a lot of. We certainly haven't been able to just say, oh, we're going to take that thing and lift it wholesale from Victoria 2 and just slap it in. It was good enough, right? Like everything has been tweaked and managed to fit in with the other mechanics.
To give an example, which you saw during the demo, instead of having one world market where everything is sort of produced and bought by everyone, there are national, more local markets, and then there's sort of imports and exports to and from those markets.
For sure, there's something new with them, but I want to start with the first thing you asked, like what role do they fill? They fill every role, sort of. Everything, that's really one of the design conceits, is that everything that you do in the game should have some impact on the pops, right? Like in Crusader Kings 3, everything needs to tie back to the character somehow. In Victoria, everything needs to have an impact on the pops, and in turn, the pops will impact the country because the society is ultimately created by the pops, right? So everything has an impact on them. In terms of new things, I think the biggest change to the pop system has been the introduction of dependents. So we don't just simulate the workforce, the people who work in your industries and who staff your government and who fight your wars, but we also simulate the people that depend on them, like the elderly, the children, and potentially like women if you don't have good gender equality in your country.
Yeah. For example, and this of course allows us to do a lot more with these things. Like, for instance, if you have pensions, that means your dependents get more income. If you abolish child labor, on the other hand, that's great for, you know, having better educated children, less mortality, and so on. But it will also reduce the income of your dependents. So we can, a lot of things that were sort of more gamey, I would say, even previously, now have much more concrete and direct and simulated effects on your pops. I will caveat that we're not going to talk too much about the military, but that we can confirm. And one other thing we're actually talking about now is having pops also be able to become dependents by being sort of wounded in war. So that one thing that can definitely happen is if too many of your soldiers die, you get like an imbalance of workforce versus dependence, which can impoverish the whole population.
But that is really central to Victoria. Is we want to make sure that a war isn't just something that costs you money, but it costs you people. There are actually people dying, and that is very, very core to the war loop.
In Wiki 3, we've chosen to put a lot more agency in the hands of the player. We want the player to be driving the game more so as sort of the game playing itself. So we have a lot more like the player under basically all the economy systems is still building buildings and making changes in your country, because this is basically the core loop of the game. And we don't want to sort of hand over control. With that said, we still have the private sector represented in the form of something we call the investment fund, which is if you have, depending on your economic system, the aristocrats and capitalists that own your buildings can invest different amounts in the investment fund, and you can tap into this money to build, but you're restricted by sort of your economic system in what you can build. So for example, if you have an agrarian system where the landowners have control of the economy, they're the ones putting money into the investment fund, and you're only allowed to use it for the things that they like. Automation might very well have a role to play in terms of making sure that you don't get overwhelmed with the micromanagement and so on if you're playing a bigger country. So that is something we're very much looking into. And we're not completely ruling out the idea of self-building, but it should be very core that the players should be making the decisions about their country in this game.
We want to make sure that infrastructure plays an enormous part in this game, because it really did in the era, and we want to reflect that. So railways is a building that you can build, and people have to work that building, and it will consume engines and coal. So it's a part of your economy. And as a result of the presence of railways, it means that you have the ability to industrialize that state more, right? So if you try to industrialize a sort of remote area without having good connections to it, then you're not going to be able to bring those goods to market, and you're going to have local price imbalance where, as an example, if you have a lot of grain being produced there, then the people who consume that grain is going to be able to buy it cheaper, but the people producing that grain isn't going to get paid as much and isn't going to be able to pay out as high wages. So generally speaking, it's better to have good infrastructure throughout your country.
Yeah, you could basically say that if you don't have the infrastructure to match how much you have developed a state, then the goods sort of get stuck in that state, and only some of them make it to market, and all the others are more available locally, which is not great for, like, there's probably not that much consumption of coal going on in a remote mining state. So you really want to bring that coal to your factories in the capital, which is a super crucial role that the railroads play.
So by default, players have control of their own market, right? So they have a national market that their states belong to. You can also join or become part of another country's market, which is something that we really want to emphasize, that kind of gameplay for the great powers in particular, to try to force other countries or entice other countries into their more developed market, right? But we want to make sure, as you pointed out, like the market system in Victoria 2 was kind of complicated, but and the player didn't have a lot of insight into it. We wanted to make sure that this was very concrete, so the player could see that if I want to improve the price of coal in this market, I need to build more coal mines or import more coal from another market, and that's going to have an impact, right? So each individual interaction here with the market should be very easy to intuit how they work, but the emergent effects are perhaps not entirely predictable.
I would also say that your national market, or the national market you're part of, is like, it is so core to how you play and how you develop your country, because
Mm-hmm.
what goods you have in your market is the goods that your buildings can use. So if you
Mm-hmm.
don't have, for example, if you're a country that has no access to coal and very limited access to wood, you're going to be very reliant on imports, which means needing ports and other infrastructure to support those imports as opposed to be able to produce this locally. So
Mm-hmm.
really what goods you're producing and what goods you're sort of available and consuming in your market is it's the most important thing, I would say. Of course, this ties super heavily into the pops as well, but it's like it is your economy essentially. So
Yeah.
this is going to be, you're always pretty much keeping an eye on what's on your market and what opportunities there are, what opportunities you can create with smart diplomatic and trade gameplay and so on.
And another really great way about having the markets more local is that you have, with every trade interaction you do, you have a very direct impact on a particular country.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas maybe in the past, if you were like reliant on buying machine parts from the world market, then yes, people making machine parts would see a slight increase in their profitability, right? But here you can choose who exactly you're importing those machine parts from, and they're going to see a very direct and concrete and big boost in their economy. So you don't want to be importing things from your rivals because you're going to literally enrich them.
Colonists will be part of your national market,
Mm-hmm.
but you will need to have like sea infrastructure. Essentially, you will need to have a large merchant navy and so on, depending on how far from a colonial empire you have. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
trivial to sort of have a large sprawling overseas market. It does require a massive fleet and
Mm-hmm.
a navy to protect it and so on. We do want the navy to play an important role, both to sort of protect your trade and to harass
Mm-hmm.
rival countries' trade, and things like using your navy to keep to sort of disrupt British access to Indian goods, for example, could have enormous impact on their economy and in turn their standing
Mm-hmm.
in the world. I would say we've even broadened it further
Okay.
because in Wiki 2 you had, like, for instance, one idea of communism, which was just sort of the Soviet state communism, but we have a lot more nuance to it. You can have different models of building ownership, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You have the sort of classical, like, for example, to take an example, in the early game, a lot of the industries might be owned by like merchant guilds, which is like shopkeeper, more middle class pops, and there's more of them. Then essentially capitalists own them and they own the buildings and they invest, but you might be changing this later on if you're going like down a very socialist route or a very like anarchist route. Then you might end up with factories that are actually entirely owned by your workers, and where the workers
Mm-hmm.
sort of pay themselves dividends instead of the capitalists hogging most of the profits.
So revolution is one possible route to this,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't want the default way of making your country socialist to be to create a socialist reaction to ultra-capitalist policies, right? So you can definitely attempt to go the route of putting your socialist trade unions in charge of the country and try to get them to enact these laws in a peaceful way. But you're
Okay.
going to get reactions as a result
Mm-hmm.
from the other political factions in your country, right? So as long as you can overcome those,
Yeah.
as long as you can keep those people happy or keep those people down,
Yeah.
then you should be able to peacefully transform your country into something very different.
Noting that there's such thing as like a pace of transformation too, where,
Mm-hmm.
for example, how much other groups get upset by changes is
Mm-hmm.
relative to sort of the scale of those changes. So to take an example, if you go straight from like absolutely no women's rights to full women's rights,
Mm-hmm.
then there's several interest groups that are probably going to be extremely angry and ready to start a war. But if you sort of take it one law at a time and give them some time to cool off from
Mm-hmm.
this, you might be able to reform the entire way in a longer time without sparking a conflict. Although they'll be a bit miffed, there will be other effects, but you can go a bunch of different routes. But ultimately, we wanted to give the player agency here again. Not to
Mm-hmm.
say that you can just pass any law you want. You do need to have an interest group backing it in government. And that also means that this group needs to be relatively influential if you want to be able to sort of pass the laws they like, which also comes very much down to your economy, because how you build up your economy and how you sort of have laws, like for instance voting rights, is very important for which interest groups have more power. For example, if you're a completely agrarian country, then you're with like no universities and things like that as well, then you have no real base for your liberals, you have no base for your trade unions, and your conservative landowners will have and like the church will have enormous power. So in that case, it might actually be straight up impossible to reform into a very like free and modern society unless you have a revolution. But if you take your time to make sure, okay, I'm going to give my workers more money, I'm going to give them more rights, and in turn, because I know a whole bunch of them might back up the trade unions, and that's going to allow me to change these laws that I want. So it is very much a Victoria thing that the economy and politics are super interconnected. The decision to go with interest groups and other parties is actually a lot of it comes down to the fact that the parties in a whole bunch of Western countries, it might be a really good representation, especially towards the end of the game. But in a lot of countries, it's actually a very poor representation of the political system, because parties might not exist. Parties might not exist until 100 years after the start of the game. And in a complete like autocracy where the absolute government, there is still these groupings, there are still these factions that have an influence, but they're not political parties calling themselves the conservatives or liberals or things like that. So we wanted a system that could sort of fit more everything, where, of course we have elections, of course we have these sort of things, and that they do tend to map to sort of things like you can probably think of the intelligentsia as being quite, not necessarily the Liberal Party, but if there's a Liberal Party, it probably draws a lot of influence from there. But this is really what it came down to, is we thought the interest group model fits better for being able to simulate all the insane variety of political systems that we needed to be able to simulate.
Yeah, the starting point is definitely historical, as you point out, right? So that's where we want to make sure that everything, or as much as we can, is 100% the way we expect. After that, we believe that the major fantasy of the player base is to take a country and make of it what you will. So we don't want to railroad you down a certain path, or say that countries have specific sort of intrinsic nature to them that you can never change. At the same time, historicity and immersion is of course super important. So we want to make sure that we add these things in. There are some things. So basically, the short answer is we have a very multifaceted approach to this. We tackle it in a bunch of different ways. But one thing that I can say is that there are certain things, like, for example, the American Civil War and the Taiping Rebellion and things like that, that are very well-known touchstones that are very likely to happen in some form or another, and they will have historical events that flavor them as well, so a player can recognize them. But that isn't to say that the American Civil War will always happen. Only if certain conditions apply, and the player can change this. So the player can change the conditions to make sure that the American Civil War does not transpire, right, and dodge that whole thing. We do this with mechanics, right? So as an example, you may have noticed from the demo, when you looked at the diplomatic plays, the diplomatic plays can show a lot of different, or model a lot of different things. But one of the things that it does is it really simulates the World War I in a good way. So it can start with a spark, with one small country demanding something small from another country, and then lots of other great powers getting involved, and suddenly you have a world war. So that means that because that's a mechanical thing, World War I might be recognizable, but it might not start because of something in the Balkans. It might start in South America, but it might still be recognizable as this huge conflict that involves the great powers that occur at roughly the same time, because that's how we balance the game.
I mean, this will come down to that again, that we don't want to set the world on a set path. Like, just like Mikael said, we don't want to say, oh, France is always going to be a liberal democracy at the end. This is so you're rewarded for going it that way. We also don't want to say World War I was just inevitable. It was always going to happen in 1914, no matter what. So while we would like the mechanics to be able to lead up, as you get like expanded diplomacy, expanded connections, these alliances build up organically, and then it ends in a giant, a foolish little thing in the Balkans that sparks a giant conflict. We would like that to absolutely be able to happen. We don't want to have these sort of beats that will just happen no matter what, because it doesn't match to the game, which is the very much idea that history is sort of yours to change. If you don't change history, if the conditions for historical events are there, they should absolutely be able to happen, but you should be able to, intentionally or not, avert them as well. I mean, I think I learned a lot of things. One of them was for sure to really, really, like with Lars, we did a lot of very big changes over the updates, and those changes were general. I think they were really good for the game, but also sometimes I wished I had more time for them. And one thing I absolutely learned for like Wiki 3 is, like, when it comes to things like complex economic systems and so on, to really take our time, to really iterate, to make sure it works in every aspect, and to not be afraid to sort of build something and keep iterating on it until it really, really works. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.